A panoply of preachers. You remember when our bishop was here a year ago, he talked about people who use those $5 words? Well, panoply is one of those $5 words. I'm fascinated by language, and I came across, it's actually in one of our hymns, and I started looking at it, and I thought that was a really good word to use somewhere in a sermon. But I want to tell you what panoply means. There are three definitions that come up if you look in the dictionary. Panoply, the first definition is a full suit of armor or ceremonial attire. Okay, I don't mean it in that way. A second definition is something forming a protective covering. Well, I really don't mean it that way. The third definition, a magnificent or impressive array. That's how I'm using the word panoply. I want to talk about a magnificent and impressive array of preachers who have served this congregation over the past 200 years. And I want us to think about the words from the letter to the Hebrews, where it says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God." Would you join me in prayer, please? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I am deeply humbled as I stand before you today. I am deeply humbled as I stand before this congregation with such a rich and incredible history, a church which has made a huge impact on countless lives, a church with a legacy that extends beyond this area and throughout southern Illinois and beyond. Even more so, I'm deeply humbled to stand in a long line of pastors and preachers who have served the people called Methodist in Mount Vernon, Illinois since the year 1818. I'm deeply humbled to be filling the shoes of luminary and even heroic figures who have faithfully preached and taught the gospel through the years. I'm deeply humbled to occupy a pulpit that has been filled with men of great stature and deep faith, whose examples both inspire me and truly humble me. Those first clergymen were preachers who rode on horseback to visit circuits of churches in the expanding Illinois frontier, teaching and preaching the doctrine and discipline of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Men such as John Fox, who served the Mount Vernon Circuit in 1829. He was a native of New Jersey, born in 1774. He entered ministry with the Philadelphia Conference in 1820, but soon thereafter moved to Illinois, where he was admitted to the Illinois Conference. It was written of him, "As a man, Brother Fox was a pattern of neatness and industry. As a Christian, uniform and consistent. As a preacher, plain, practical, and pointed. And as a pastor, faithful and affectionate." It is also reported that a parishioner once counted 32 stories he told in just one sermon. And as a devoted Methodist, he was also known to be a rigid disciplinarian, excluding from the church many of those who had been received by his predecessor, John Fox. Or Miles Huffaker, who assisted in the Mount Vernon Circuit in 1830. He was a native of Kentucky who was converted at the age of 9. It is remembered that his abilities for preaching were but moderate, but he was a good man and a laborious minister, which is an elegant way of saying he was a lousy preacher, but a hardworking pastor. Or James Massey, who served the Mount Vernon Circuit in 1838. His colleague described him in this way: "He had a voice like a bugle and lungs that never got sore or hoarse." Wouldn't you love to have him today? Now, I myself have a lot of personal appreciation for Orson F. Fisher, who served the circuit in 1826. He was described as one of the most profound, critical, and brilliant preachers of that day. The story is told of a wealthy merchant who was greatly bothered by Brother Fisher's preaching, so much so that he swore that the next time he ran into Dr. Fisher, he'd whip him. Well, Fisher heard about this threat, and one day he passed by the merchant's door. The merchant, who was described as a stout man, stormed out of the door, pulled off his coat, and confronted the preacher. Dr. Fisher, who is described as a small and quite feeble man, immediately fell to his knees and prayed that God would bless and save this merchant, who quickly retreated back into his store while his wicked comrades laughed and taunted him, saying he wasn't willing to fight a man in prayer. Now, that's great stuff. But I especially appreciate that Dr. Orson F. Fisher in 1840 left Illinois to go to the Republic of Texas in 1840 and spread the Methodist doctrine and discipline there. Orson F. Fisher. As the church at Mount Vernon became more and more settled, there were other great men who served as pastors. There was Ephraim Joy, who served this church in 1857. One thing I discovered about him is that he founded the Carmi Weekly Times newspaper, he and his family. And he also was a source of encouragement to other pastors who came along after him, at least two of whom served this church, Dr. John Leeper and Dr. John Harmon. There's Dr. James Leeton, who was born in England in 1817. He moved with his family to the United States at the age of 17 and was subsequently converted to Christ in Sangamon County. And Dr. Leeton went on to write a book that I have been using in my research, The History of Methodism in Illinois, 1793 to 1832. I actually started reading the book and then realized he'd been a pastor here. I hadn't made that connection. I was also very interested to learn about Dr. George Whitten. Does anybody remember Dr. George Whitten? Lucy Baker remembers Dr. Whitten, and some in the back there. He served as our pastor from 1947 to 1949, and he became known as the fishing preacher because he liked to fish so much. In fact, at his retirement celebration, this church presented him with a $2,000 travel trailer in appreciation for his ministry. Now, that was $2,000 in 1949. Now, Dr. Whitten wasn't the only pastor to love the outdoors. In my research, I also uncovered some dirt. In 1878, a grand jury indicted our pastor, Reverend C.E. Klein, for hunting on enclosed premises without permission. Now, I don't know the outcome of that lawsuit, but at some point he did head out west to Oregon. There are also other pastors in more recent memory who many of you will recall, and some of you may have known. Bain Wilson, who led the city of Mount Vernon in an extraordinary campaign to be named as an All-American city in the 1950s. His daughter, Annette, is here with us. Raise your hand, Annette, and her husband, Tom. They've been good friends of ours for a while. Dale Harmon, who served here when the education building was built. His uncle also served as a pastor of this church. Clyde Funkhauser, who was extremely involved in the community, especially in the early days of Wren Lake College. And my connection to Clyde Funkhauser is his son Paul taught me math at McKendree College. And of course, our dearly beloved Billy Haas, who was our longest serving pastor, 15 years, and Eloise is with us today, and we're delighted by that, aren't we? Alan Ryan, now serving down at Carbondale, and my immediate predecessor, David Adie. I'll tell you another story about David Adie. Some years ago, 20 years ago, I wrote an article that was published in a college journal. And David Adie, who I only knew as a superintendent up north, he was the superintendent of the Illinois River District up in Peoria, he sent me a letter after I wrote that article. A wonderful note of appreciation, which I've saved through the years. And he closes that letter saying, "Thank you for your valuable contribution to the church in both word and deed." 20 years ago. I was and I am deeply touched, greatly encouraged by his kind and affirming words. In my 6 months or so of researching the pastors of the First United Methodist Church, there is one of them who's kind of become a hero for me. His name was John Francis Harmon. He served as the pastor of this congregation from 1897 to 1901, the turn of the 20th century. John Harmon was born in Olney in 1860. He grew up on a farm in rural Louisville, Illinois. They literally lived off the land. And with a modicum of formal education, he went on to get a college degree. He and his brother Joe went on to attend seminary at Garrett Biblical Institute at Evanston. And they returned to the Southern Illinois Conference as, I understand, the first seminary-trained clergy in the conference. After his career in Mount Vernon, his career took him to the First Methodist Episcopal Church in East St. Louis, which eventually was the largest church in our conference. He went on to become president of McKendree College, and then finally president of Kansas Wesleyan College. From those crude and humble beginnings, John Harmon became one of the most distinguished clergymen in Southern Illinois. He once met the President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt. He often shared a stage with William Jennings Bryan. And he hobnobbed with millionaires from throughout the nation because of his work throughout the denomination. John Harmon, in fact, had a very special gift for being able to raise money. I could use his help today. During his time in Mount Vernon, it is reported that Dr. Harmon received more than 500 persons into membership, which puts me to shame. And he was also the pastor who started a mission church on the east side of town that we now know as Epworth. I've learned a lot about Dr. Harmon because his daughter, Grace Harmon McGarry, wrote a biography of him on Business for the King, the Portrait of a Man. And she has a chapter on each of the places he served during his life, and there's an entire chapter devoted to his ministry in Mount Vernon. Let me tell you something, you could not have come up with a more interesting movie script. It's really amazing. So I just want to share 3 or 4 stories from John Harmon's ministry in Mount Vernon. One morning, a beautiful 16-year-old girl, the daughter of a doctor in town, learned that news of some of her escapades had reached the pastor via the grapevine. She visited Dr. Harmon and said she was sorry if she had violated any of the rules of the church, and she told him that she wanted to do something. "What can I do?" she insisted. And she promised to give him 3 hours every Thursday afternoon to serve and help in any way that she could. I think a guilty conscience was really working on her. So Dr. Harmon gave her some instructions. He said, "Come to my study at 1 o'clock and bring your violin." She was a talented violinist and apparently had a big, charismatic personality. On Thursday afternoon, she arrived. Harmon directed her to go to a home, a tiny house a block west where an old doctor lived. This doctor had been blind for so long that most people had forgotten him. He and his wife were very poor, and they were in very feeble health. Dr. Harmon said to this young woman named Stella, "When you knock, a thin, a weak voice will say, 'Come in.' Say nothing when you enter. Just begin to play. Play that sad, beautiful strain that I told you makes me want to cry when I hear it. Play it until the man weeps. Then give him the funniest reading you know. Make him laugh. Then slip out without a word. And later I'll go by and see what he has to say." Well, the young woman did just that. And later that same day, Dr. Harmon visited the doctor, who reported in great excitement that an angel had been to see him. Stella made this into a long-time habit, bringing joy into the homes of shut-ins where there'd been no joy for a very long time. Another story. One autumn day, a church member, Captain Samuel Watson, and if I have read my history correctly, Captain Watson, a Civil War veteran, owned an implement business here in town, and he passed that on to his son, Fred Watson, whose name you'll see on the side of the Rare Chop House because that was his music and implement store. Captain Watson handed John Harmon $3 and said, "Make somebody happy at Thanksgiving." For weeks, Harmon kept the money in his desk, praying that he could figure out how to do the greatest good with it. Then one Sunday, he announced from the pulpit, which would have been somewhere over here, that in his pocket were $13 and a bank book. He said that he didn't want to compete with the local banks, and he didn't want to hand out charity, but starting on Monday morning, he'd be opening a bank in his church office, which was over here. If you need a short-term loan, he told them, and can't get it from a local bank, I will loan you the money without interest, note, or security. Also, he said, anyone who wanted to contribute to the bank could do so. As he greeted people after worship that day, people stuffed cash into his pockets as they left the church. And when he totaled it up, it amounted to $80, which is quite a handsome sum in the 1890s. Harmon repeated the announcement in the evening worship service, saying that he was in his study every morning at 9 o'clock, and if any church member was in a tight spot and needed help, they could come in and get it. Well, at 9 o'clock, the very next morning, the new superintendent of schools showed up in his office. He had just joined the church the previous day. Harmon said, "What can I do for you?" And the man explained that he just received a telegram informing him of his sister's death, and he had no money to go to the funeral, and he hadn't been in town long enough to establish credit with any of the banks. Pastor Harmon expressed his sympathy and asked, "How much do you need?" And the man said, $5. Harmon gave him $5. The next Monday, the superintendent returned to Harmon's office and repaid him $6. And most people gratefully returned more than they had borrowed. And Harmon made over 80 loans that year without losing a penny. The most interesting stories about John Harmon's time in Mount Vernon are related to his campaign against alcohol and his advocacy for temperance, which Methodists wholeheartedly embraced at that time. I don't know why there's nervous laughter behind me, but things change, don't they? Honestly, alcohol in that day was much like the drug epidemic today. Alcohol destroyed families, broke up marriages, men lost jobs because of their drinking, and the Methodists were anti-alcohol. Well, there's too much to tell in this short time, but let me tell you a little bit about that. 4 of the 5 years that Dr. Harmon was here in Mount Vernon, the county was dry. However, the leading officials of the city were pro-alcohol. The sheriff and the deputy sheriff were both pro-alcohol, and they were Irish Catholic bachelors at that. The circuit judge was pro-alcohol, and all of them turned a blind eye to all the illegal saloons that were operating throughout the community. In his campaign against the saloons, Harmon usually got the best of the sheriff, and there began to be rumors of threats against Harmon's life. One day, a letter was delivered to his door by an attorney, which was quickly followed by a box delivered by an implement, a hardware merchant. Inside the box was a revolver with 100 cartridges, and the letter was a permit from the mayor to carry a revolver. Not long afterward, another letter arrived. Written in crude longhand, it said, "Drop the fight, leave town, or be shot." Now, I love what John Harmon did. First thing he did is he walked down to the newspaper so they could publish it. Then he went over to the sheriff's office. And as he walked into the office, he looked down at the sheriff's ledger. And he noticed, rather curiously, that the handwriting of the threatening letter matched the handwriting of the sheriff in his ledger. The sheriff walked over and looked over Harmon's shoulder and innocently asked, "Have you any idea who wrote that letter?" Harmon laughed and said, "Easy, Sheriff. There's only one dolt in the county ignorant enough to do such terrible spelling." A few evenings later, as Mrs. Harmon, Molly, was throwing out the dishwater, she heard a rattle from the trees in the yard of the parsonage, which was just behind this sanctuary. And the next morning, Harmon's oldest son found an unexploded tin of dynamite. Harmon, who was fearless, blew up part of his backyard with what was said to be a blast that shook that end of town. Well, the fight against alcohol intensified, and one night, John Harmon was walking home from the mission church, and he was surrounded by a group of young people from First Church, which included his oldest daughter. As they passed a doorway, a gunshot rang out and struck one of the youth that was with him, killing him. John Harmon had been the intended target. The murder rallied a number of the citizens of the community to stand with Harmon and confront the corruption and evils of the city, but it remained a hard-fought battle. In fact, they quickly formed what they called a law and order league. The first guy that was elected the chairman of that law and order league, they burned down his silo with 6,000 bushels of grain. Burned down the next guy's home. I think Fred Watson, they burned his business down when he was elected chair. Well, it was a hard-fought battle. One final story. One of the saloon keepers one day climbed onto a box on a street corner and called for 30 witnesses. When 30 people had gathered around him, he made an oath that he would neither eat nor sleep until he had killed John Harmon. Can you imagine? A week or so later, Harmon received word that this saloon keeper was dying of quick consumption. Harmon immediately went to his door. The man's mother recognized him and with fierce curses ordered him out of the yard. "All right," said Harmon, "tell your boy I'm sorry for him." 6 successive days, Harmon returned to the house, and each time he was ordered away with cursing. The 7th day, which was the Sabbath, the dying man said he wanted to see him, and Harmon went gladly. The home was a place of deep poverty. The floors were covered with papers upon which the sick man had been spitting. Harmon said, "What do you want?" And the man said he wanted Harmon to pray for him. First, Harmon asked, "Tell me how many of your 30 witnesses have been to see you." "Not one," he answered. 2 came, looked in at the door, and went away. After praying with this dying saloon keeper, the man accepted Christ as Savior and asked for Harmon to return the next day to baptize him. Harmon came, baptized him, as well as his wife, whom the sheriff had forced the man to marry. And just a few days later, John Harmon conducted the funeral for his former enemy. Incidentally, when John Harmon left Mount Vernon and was appointed to East St. Louis, he became known as the bomb-proof preacher. This article is from a St. Louis newspaper, and you can see at the bottom, Reverend John F. Harmon, who aroused enmity of saloon element at Mount Vernon, Illinois, some time ago, now making vigorous fight against evil in East Side City. All true stories that took place within this community and within this church. And some really extraordinary men of God who have served as extraordinary examples for others. In the letter to the Hebrews, there's that lengthy recitation of all the saints and heroes of the Hebrew faith. And that litany is concluded by these words: "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of God." You see, not only are we surrounded by these great preachers and pastors who've been such incredible examples for us, even more significantly, we are surrounded by a vast array of faithful men and women from the past 2 centuries who established a Methodist society in Mount Vernon, who persevered and sacrificed to build several places of worship, who taught and lived the faith, who proclaimed through their words and deeds the good news of Jesus Christ, so that the next generation might embrace it. That great cloud of witnesses, those saints and pioneers, those mothers and fathers and grandparents surround us even now in the year 2017, cheering us on and encouraging us to run our race looking to Jesus, who would not let a cross get in the way of his fulfilling God's purposes for his life. I love a quote from Dr. Jonas Salk, who developed the polio vaccine in the 20th century. I want you to listen carefully to this and reflect upon it today. Jonas Salk said this: "Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors." My brothers and sisters of the First and Finest United Methodist Church, what will our legacy be for generations yet unborn? What kind of ancestor will you be? Let us pray. Honestly, God, we can't begin to imagine the many stories and the many lives that are part of this church's past. But we know that having served you faithfully, they now cheer us on. And through their sacrifices, their example, these saints encourage us to live boldly and faithfully with our eyes fixed on Jesus. As we enter into our 200th year as a congregation, renew our spirits, reignite our passion for the gospel, and use us in touching people in this community and in reaching persons yet unborn with the message of your love and your saving grace. This we pray through Christ our Lord. Amen. Remember our app, our website, findhopedowntown.org, through which you can give, stay connected, or watch sermon videos that you might have